A patient in a rehabilitation ward in Shanghai moves a cursor on a screen using only electrical signals from their cortex. No surgery breakthrough announcement, no global press conference, just a hospital workflow note updated and archived. At almost the same time, in the United States, a similar class of brain-computer interface system is still sitting inside a regulatory pipeline where reviewers are asking for more longitudinal safety data, more artifact suppression validation, more clarity on electrode degradation curves over time. Both systems claim to be solving the same problem, restoring lost motor function through neural decoding. But they are not moving at the same speed of acceptance, and that difference is not technical. It is procedural architecture. What looks like a technology gap is increasingly a governance gap disguised as science. And the uncomfortable part is this. The world is beginning to normalize two different definitions of safe enough for the human brain. The next few minutes are not about which side is right. They are about how those definitions are being quietly embedded into hospitals, regulators, and funding systems before most people even notice they have diverged. There is a tendency to treat brain-computer interfaces as a single technological frontier. Electrodes in the cortex, decoding motor intention, translating neural spikes into commands. That framing is technically correct, but structurally incomplete, because the real constraint is no longer signal decoding accuracy. In controlled environments, modern systems already reach functional thresholds that would have been considered experimental success a decade ago. The constraint has shifted to deployment legitimacy. In China's hospital-linked research environment, especially in neurology and rehabilitation centers affiliated with major universities, clinical trials for invasive and semi-invasive BCI systems are often embedded directly into treatment pipelines. That does not mean absence of regulation. It means regulation is integrated into institutional execution. In the United States, the same class of devices typically moves through a more separated sequence: research phase, device classification review, pre-market approval, post-market surveillance design, and iterative FDA feedback loops. Each step is explicitly compartmentalized. Neither model is inherently superior, but they produce different timelines for the same hardware. And timelines in neural technology are not neutral. They decide which datasets become dominant, which electrode designs scale, and which failure modes get discovered early versus late. One detail matters here. Neural decoding systems are not static products. They are feedback systems that improve with usage density. The more patients, the more calibration data. The more calibration data, the more robust the decoding models become. So a system deployed in a higher throughput clinical environment does not just roll out faster. It potentially learns faster. That is the part most public discussions miss. A regulatory delay is not just administrative friction. It is also a delay in exposure to real-world neural variability, stroke profiles, trauma patterns, degenerative disease diversity. But the reverse is also true. Faster deployment means earlier exposure to edge case failure modes that are not always visible in controlled trials. So what we are really comparing is not innovation versus stagnation. It is two different strategies for discovering failure in systems that interface directly with the human brain. One discovers it before scale. One risks discovering it during scale. And both claim safety as their endpoint. There is a historical pattern that helps frame this, though it is imperfect. In medical imaging in the late 20th century, CT and MRI systems followed different regulatory adoption curves across regions. Some countries prioritized rapid clinical integration under supervised protocols. Others required longer device validation cycles before broad hospital deployment. The outcome was not a single winner. It was a divergence in dataset accumulation. Different populations, different scanning protocols, different artifact baselines. BCI systems are more sensitive than imaging systems because they are not just reading biology, they are interacting with it in real time. That interaction creates a subtle shift in responsibility. A decoding error in imaging affects diagnosis. A decoding error in BCI affects agency. the sense of control over movement itself, which is why regulatory bodies treat them differently. But they are also responding to different institutional incentives. Hospitals are under pressure to treat. Regulators are under pressure to prevent failure modes that are rare but severe. Both incentives are rational. They simply do not align temporally. And that misalignment is becoming the defining feature of early neural interface deployment. There is a report from Tsinghua-affiliated neuroengineering groups describing implant-assisted motor rehabilitation trials, where patients achieved measurable cursor control improvements within weeks of calibration cycles. The technical detail is not controversial in itself. What matters is the environment in which those cycles are repeated, because repetition is what turns experimental systems into stable models. My opinion is not that one system is ahead. It is that we are watching two different definitions of acceptable neurological risk become operational at the same time, without a shared global benchmark. The doubt, and it is not a small one, is whether faster clinical integration actually produces better long-term safety data, or whether it simply shifts uncertainty into later stages where reversal is harder. The prediction, cautiously stated, is that within the next decade, the global BCI landscape will not converge on a single regulatory model. It will fragment into interoperable but philosophically different ecosystems, where approved for clinical use does not mean the same thing across regions. And that fragmentation will matter more than the electrodes themselves. Because once neural systems begin to scale beyond laboratory settings, the real competition is not decoding accuracy. It is whose definition of safe enough to connect to a human brain becomes the default assumption in practice. A useful way to understand brain-computer interfaces is to stop thinking of them as devices and start thinking of them as clinical translation systems. Not machines you invent, but pipelines that decide how biology becomes usable instruction. And pipelines behave differently depending on where they sit. In China's hospital-linked neurotechnology programs, particularly those associated with large teaching hospitals in Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen, BCI systems are increasingly embedded inside rehabilitation units rather than isolated research labs. The system is not tested and then handed over. It is iterated inside the same clinical environment where patients are treated. That distinction sounds minor until you track what actually changes. In a traditional Western regulatory pathway, take the FDA's device approval structure, a neural interface typically moves through defined stages: investigational device exemption, controlled clinical trial phases, then pre-market approval with tightly specified endpoints. Each stage is designed to reduce uncertainty before exposure increases. In the embedded hospital model, uncertainty is reduced by continuous exposure. The result is not simply faster deployment, it is a different geometry of learning. Data does not accumulate in discrete trial blocks. It accumulates as a continuous stream from routine clinical use cases. That changes what the system knows at any given moment. And this is where the technical story starts to bend into something more structural. Brain-computer interfaces are not like pacemakers or insulin pumps. They are adaptive decoding systems. The model that interprets neural signals is partially shaped by the very patients using it. That means the clinical environment is not just a deployment site, it is part of the training loop. So if you compress time to deployment, you are not just accelerating access, you are accelerating model evolution itself. This is where a quiet tension appears, because regulatory systems like the FDA are optimized for bounded risk estimation. You define failure modes, you constrain exposure, you quantify safety margins. But adaptive neural systems do not stay within fixed boundaries once deployed at scale. They drift, not randomly, but structurally. As electrode conditions change, as patients adapt, as decoding models update. And drift is hard to certify in advance. One paper often cited in neural engineering circles, from Stanford's Neural Prosthetics Translational Lab, showed that signal stability in intracortical arrays can degrade or shift meaningfully over months, requiring recalibration strategies that effectively turn the device into a living system rather than a static implant. Now, here's the subtle point most policy discussions miss. Recalibration is not just maintenance. It is continued learning under real-world conditions. So the regulatory question quietly becomes, do you approve a device or do you approve an ongoing learning process? Different systems are answering that differently without explicitly stating it. There is a real-world case that illustrates the divergence without turning it into ideology. In several Chinese rehabilitation hospitals affiliated with major university medical systems, non-invasive EEG-based BCIs have been used for post-stroke motor recovery training, where patients interact with virtual limb systems. These are not experimental demos in isolated labs. They are integrated into therapy cycles alongside physical rehabilitation. In parallel, similar systems in the United States often remain within hospital research collaborations or limited clinical trials, with stricter segmentation between therapy and device validation. Same category of technology, different definition of what counts as routine care, and that difference compounds over time. Because once a system becomes routine care, it generates scale data, not just performance metrics, but failure distributions across populations. That is what allows iterative refinement of decoding algorithms and electrode strategies. But routine care also compresses uncertainty into the present tense. You are no longer simulating risk, you are absorbing it. Neither approach eliminates risk, they just distribute it differently across time. Here is the counter-argument that regulators in the FDA framework would reasonably make. If you allow adaptive neural systems into wide clinical use before long-term stability is fully characterized, you risk normalizing subtle failure modes, not catastrophic failures, but drift in control accuracy, unintended neural adaptation patterns, or device-dependent variability in outcomes. And once those patterns are normalized across thousands of patients, reversing course becomes nearly impossible without disrupting ongoing care. That argument is not theoretical. It is grounded in decades of medical device history, where early adoption outpaced understanding of long-term degradation behavior. So the conservative structure is not irrational. It is historically informed caution applied to a new class of interface. But there is a gap in that logic when applied to machine learning-based neural decoders. Because delay does not freeze the technology, it externalizes development elsewhere, which brings us back to the present divergence. My opinion is that we are not watching a race in brain-computer interfaces. We are watching a divergence in what clinical truth even means for adaptive systems. The doubt is whether regulatory separation actually improves safety, or whether it simply slows the accumulation of real-world edge case knowledge that only emerges under sustained use. And the prediction, tentative but increasingly difficult to ignore, is that within the next major generation of neural prosthetics, approval status will matter less than ecosystem density. The system with more continuous clinical feedback loops will not just deploy faster, it will define the default operating assumptions of the technology. Not because it is more advanced in theory, but because it has been allowed to encounter more of reality sooner. And in neural interfaces, reality is not something you simulate forever. It is something you eventually wire into the system itself. There is a moment in every emerging medical technology where the conversation quietly stops being about capability and starts being about governance lag. Brain-computer interfaces are reaching that point faster than most people realize. Not because the science suddenly jumped, it didn't, but because the systems around it are no longer synchronized. In the United States regulatory model, the FDA's Center for Devices and Radiological Health treats implantable neural interfaces as high-risk, high-uncertainty systems. The default posture is to reduce unknowns before exposure expands. That means endpoints must be clearly defined. Signal-to-noise thresholds, infection rates, electrode longevity, cognitive side effect monitoring. Everything is structured around pre-specification. You define what success looks like before the system is widely used. In contrast, in China's hospital-integrated neurotechnology environment, especially within large tertiary medical systems, success criteria are increasingly being refined during deployment. Not in a reckless sense, but in a tightly controlled clinical network where rehabilitation outcomes, neural signal quality, and device iteration cycles are continuously logged across large patient cohorts. Same technology class, two different epistemologies. One assumes you can know enough before scale. The other assumes you only know through scale. This is where the technical reality of BCIs becomes important again, because it refuses to behave like a static medical device category. A modern brain-computer interface, even a non-invasive EEG-based system, is not a fixed instrument. It is a closed-loop adaptive decoder. It maps neural patterns to outputs, then adjusts based on feedback. The system improves as it interacts with the user. That means every deployment is also a training event. And here is the uncomfortable implication. If training is happening inside hospitals, then hospitals are no longer just treatment sites. They are distributed learning nodes in a global model refinement process. This is not speculative. It is already how machine learning-assisted prosthetic control systems operate in multiple research hospitals worldwide. The difference is whether that learning loop is tightly bounded by regulatory stages or continuously running inside clinical care. Once you see that, the divergence stops looking administrative and starts looking structural. A concrete example helps. In stroke rehabilitation studies conducted in major Chinese neurology centers, including work associated with university-linked hospitals in Shanghai, EEG-based motor imagery systems are used to help patients retrain motor pathways. Patients attempt to imagine movement. The system decodes intention signals, and visual feedback reinforces neural plasticity. The interesting part is not the concept. That has existed for years. The interesting part is scale and continuity. Repeated sessions across large patient populations generate dense data sets of neural variability. Different stroke severities, ages, recovery timelines, comorbidities. That diversity matters more than raw sample size, because neural signals are not standardized inputs. They are biologically noisy, context-dependent, and time-evolving. So the system that sees more variation earlier doesn't just improve faster, it may converge on more robust decoding strategies sooner. But there is a cost hidden inside that advantage. The cost is that error modes are discovered inside live therapeutic environments rather than pre-market simulation frameworks. And that changes what acceptable failure means in practice. Now, the FDA-aligned model would argue something very precise here. If adaptive neural systems are allowed to iterate inside real patients too early, then you risk embedding flawed decoding assumptions into clinical practice. Once those assumptions scale, they become extremely difficult to unwind because downstream systems, rehab protocols, insurance frameworks, device manufacturing, adapt around them. In other words, early mistakes become infrastructure. That concern is not abstract. It mirrors historical patterns in medical device adoption, where early calibration choices persisted long after better methods existed. But the counterpoint is equally grounded. If you delay deployment until full characterization is complete, you are effectively freezing a system whose performance depends on exposure to biological diversity. And in neural interfaces, that diversity is not a side detail. It is the core input distribution. So delay doesn't just slow approval. It reduces the system's ability to learn from real-world edge cases. Here is the reversal that rarely gets stated clearly. BCI systems are not being evaluated like drugs. They behave more like evolving statistical organisms embedded in clinical environments, which means traditional approval logic, test, approve, deploy, does not map cleanly onto how they actually improve. This is where the divergence becomes visible at a systems level. One regulatory philosophy tries to contain learning before exposure. The other allows learning through controlled exposure. Both are attempts to manage the same uncertainty. They just place the boundary at different points in time. My opinion is that neither approach is fully adapted to what BCIs are becoming. Both are still anchored in a mental model where medical devices are stable objects rather than adaptive systems that co-evolve with users. The doubt is whether current regulatory frameworks can even be modified fast enough to match this shift, or whether they will remain structurally behind until failures force redesign. The prediction is that within the next decade, the real dividing line will not be approved versus unapproved neural interfaces. It will be systems that are allowed to continuously learn in clinical environments versus systems that are forced into periodic, frozen evaluation states. And those two categories will not just perform differently, they will produce different versions of what we consider medically reliable truth. Not because one side is careless, but because in adaptive brain systems, knowledge itself depends on how quickly you are allowed to encounter reality. There is a point in technological history where you stop being able to separate the device from the institution hosting it. Brain-computer interfaces are crossing that line. And once that happens, the question is no longer who has better neural decoding. It becomes which healthcare system is structurally capable of absorbing a living feedback loop inside patient care without breaking its own definitions of safety. That is a very different kind of competition. By now, the technical baseline is not in dispute. Intracortical and non-invasive BCIs can decode intention signals well enough to control cursors, robotic limbs, and in some experimental settings, communication interfaces for locked-in patients. Published work from groups like Brown University's BrainGate Consortium has already shown multi-year evolution of control performance in human participants with implanted arrays. So the frontier is not proof of concept anymore. It is persistence under real-world conditions. In China's hospital-linked deployment model, persistence is being tested inside a tightly integrated clinical loop. Neurology wards, rehabilitation units, and device engineering teams often sit within the same institutional umbrella. That structure reduces friction between observation, adjustment, and redeployment. A decoder performs poorly in session 1. It is adjusted. Session 2 reflects that change. The loop continues. The system behaves less like a static medical device and more like a continuously calibrated service. In the United States regulatory structure, the same loop is intentionally interrupted. Updates are not simply technical improvements. They are treated as regulated events requiring new validation cycles depending on severity of change. That introduces what engineers quietly call iteration latency. Latency is not just delay. It is a constraint on how quickly a system can incorporate lived neural variability. And neural variability is not optional. It is the data set. Here is a detail that matters more than it looks. Neural interfaces degrade in interpretability over time due to biological encapsulation, electrode impedance changes, and signal drift. This is not a failure mode. It is expected physiology, which means every BCI system is fighting entropy in real time. So performance depends not only on initial calibration quality, but on how quickly recalibration can occur relative to drift. Now ask a simple structural question. Which governance model adapts faster to drift? One that allows continuous clinical recalibration, or one that requires formal reauthorization cycles for each meaningful update? The answer is not theoretical. It is embedded in system design. A useful analogy, imperfect but instructive, is aviation autopilot evolution. Early autopilot systems were rigid, fixed rules, limited adaptation, heavy certification requirements for updates. Modern systems, while still heavily regulated, incorporate far more iterative software refinement cycles, often based on fleet-wide operational data. The key shift was not just better sensors or algorithms, it was regulatory adaptation to continuous improvement cycles. BCIs are earlier in that transition, but the direction of pressure is similar. Static certification models versus continuous learning systems. The difference is that here, the user is not just a pilot. It is the human nervous system itself, which raises the stakes of iteration timing dramatically. There is also an under-discussed economic layer. Continuous clinical deployment generates dense proprietary data sets, neural signal patterns tied to recovery trajectories, device configurations, electrode placements, and patient-specific adaptations. That data is not just scientific, it is strategic. Because once decoding models improve with scale, the advantage does not reset easily. It compounds through iterative refinement cycles that are difficult to replicate without equivalent patient throughput. So regulatory structure is indirectly shaping data advantage accumulation, not through funding, through allowed speed of learning. Now, the counterpoint deserves to be stated clearly. Regulatory caution frameworks like those used by the FDA exist because medical history is full of systems that scaled too early, embedded subtle errors, and took years to correct. In neural systems, where subjective experience is directly involved, the margin for acceptable error is even thinner. An unstable decoder is not just a technical issue. It can distort rehabilitation outcomes, introduce user frustration, or, in extreme cases, reinforce maladaptive neural patterns. So slowing iteration is not bureaucratic inertia. It is risk containment applied to a system where errors propagate into cognition. That concern is legitimate. The tension is that containment and learning speed are pulling in opposite directions. My opinion is that we are entering a phase where regulatory systems will be forced to choose what they optimize for: prevention of rare failure modes or acceleration of system-wide learning from real-world neurological diversity. Right now, most frameworks still assume they can maximize both simultaneously. That assumption is becoming harder to maintain. The doubt is whether either system can hold its current balance once BCIs move beyond rehabilitation into broader cognitive augmentation or long-term neural monitoring. That expansion would multiply both risk surface and data value at the same time, a combination most regulatory models are not designed for. The prediction is relatively narrow. Within the next generation of brain-computer interface deployment, the dominant advantage will not belong to the system with the most advanced decoding algorithm, but to the system that can legally and structurally sustain the highest frequency of safe recalibration cycles inside real clinical environments. And that will quietly redefine what advanced even means in this field. Not faster thought control, but faster permission to learn from the brain itself.